Now I'm ready to start baking what I call utility textures. And essentially what we're going to do is capture the high resolution detail from our sculpture into texture format that we can use to augment the hand painted color texture we're going to do in the near future. And what these serve to do is to easily increase the detail level of that hand painted texture map so we don't have to do it by hand. But also it will serve to bridge the gap between the high resolution geometry and the texture, which really have no connection without baking these maps. And so we're already kind of set up already to begin baking a map with this UV test texture that we created. Since it passed the test, we no longer need it, and I can simply rename it to be skin underscore utility underscore DISPA. All right, that DISP stands for displacement. And just to double check the properties, we don't need it to be a UV grid. We can make it blank, though it really doesn't matter. When we start baking, it's going to overwrite what's ever there anyway. And we are going to leave it at 4096 by 4096. Now, some of you might be asking, why not do 8K? Of course, an 8K texture would offer a lot more detail potential. However, Blender doesn't really handle 8K textures very well, especially not when we will be layering several of them together in the same material. And so I want to avoid the workflow being any slower than it has to be. And in my experience, we really don't need 8K. 4K is going to be enough to capture that really high level of detail that we're trying to achieve. And so with our texture set up, we can take a look at our bake settings, which are in the render panel, and they're only accessible through cycles. Eevee does not support baking. You can use CPU or GPU for baking. I actually think CPU is a little bit faster in my experience, but when I was rehearsing, it made my user interface flicker a little uncomfortably. So I'm going to go with GPU instead. But baking is similar to rendering, and some of the settings are relevant, like the sample count, for example. While you can bake things like lighting and surface material and reflections into a texture, which is basically baking a full render into a texture, where you would want the same sample count as in a render, we're only baking geometric detail, which means we really only need one sample. We're not actually calculating lighting or shading. If you have it at 128, it will work fine, but it'll take a lot longer and unnecessarily so. So I'm going to change that to 1, and then the other one is going to be performance under the tile size. So typically with rendering, you want to keep that tile size lower, like the default 64, but in this case, we can make it the same resolution as our texture, so we'll go 4096. Now, if you're working with 8K, it might be too much, so you can dial it back to like 1024. Basically, the principle being much larger tile sizes. If you, again, go to 32 or 64, it will work fine, but it'll take a lot longer, and it's not necessary. So I'll set that to the size of our texture resolution, 4096. Okay, that's it for the render samples. Now for the bake options themselves. First, we're going to be using this feature, Bake from Multi-Res. So this facilitates two specific types of baking, normals and displacement. As you could guess by the name of our texture, we're going to go with displacement. And then the margin I'll set to 10 pixels. This is how much the bake data extends beyond our UV islands. You do want it to extend a little bit beyond, because if you go down to 0 pixels, you'll have an anti-aliased edge right along your texture seams and it'll be noticeable. So you want to overshoot with a little bit of margin. Everything else is going to be fine. Now with regards to multi-res, if we go to our modifier panel, essentially what we're doing is taking source geometry and calculating the geometric distance against the target geometry. So the source is your render levels, which is 6. It's our highest level of subdivision. And the target is your level viewport. So let's go down to 0 for maximum difference and see how the displacement turns out in this case. And admittedly, baking is kind of finicky, so you need to have all your ducks in a row. Like you need to have a texture created, you need to have the texture node selected in the shader editor, you need to have your geometry selected, you need to have your multi-res modifier enabled and set up properly, you need to have your bake settings set up properly in order to avoid errors. And so I think I got all that set up. Trust me, every time I bake texture maps, I kind of cross my fingers and hope I did it right. And so that's what I'm going to do now and wish for the best. All right, everything looks good. It's progressing nicely. No errors either, no warnings. Ah, perfect. All right, so let's take a look. Keep in mind, I do have the texture color mode enabled, and that's why we can see whatever texture is selected in the viewport. If you don't see that happen, you probably have one of the other modes selected like material. But texture will allow us to see exactly how our bake looks on the model. Now, it is at the lowest resolution, so just for viewing purposes, I'm going to change that back to 2. And let's take a look at what displacement does. Basically, the difference in the geometry from the source, the high res, to the target, the low res, calculates dark values for low spots and bright values for high spots. And the result is this beautiful black and white map that represents geometric shapes in the face. And if we use this as a subtle overlay on the color texture we're going to paint, we get these tonal varieties very easily, and they're related to the geometry. And so this is an excellent bake, and I'm going to save it as displacement A. And I want to be sure to click the save button and save it in a safe place, which will be my text folder. And we can save it as a black and white. I'll save it as 16-bit, just so it's a higher quality, and save the image. All right. Next, we can Shift D to duplicate this texture and click the 2 to make it a unique texture. All right, this one will be displacement B. And the only difference with this one is we're going to change the target geometry. All right, we baked the last one at 0, and I'm going to bake this one at 2. So the higher we go, the closer we get to the source, the less of a difference between the two. And practically this works out to isolate the displacement data to be our finer details, like pores and wrinkles. And so let's bake it at a level of 2. I shouldn't have to change any settings. I should be able to just click the bake button. And I don't see a difference. Sometimes the viewport or cycles will need to reload the texture. Okay, yeah, so just moving the viewport managed to do that. Now, you can see that there is a little bit of information here, but it's really subtle. It's close to that gray range. And so we need to increase the contrast. To do this, I will switch over to Material Preview, Shift-Control-Click on this displacement texture, and simulate what we will need to do in the final material, which is add a color ramp and dial in the contrast and value of each texture as needed. So if I increase the contrast, now you can see what we're getting. All right, so it's not nearly the broad tonal shapes we got from the first bake. It's much more isolated to smaller frequency details. And so this is a great secondary displacement map. We'll use both of them as we see fit. And I will remember to save this before I lose it. So we'll click save. And I messed up. So I duplicated the texture, but it was still using the same texture file on my hard drive. So when I saved that, you can see it's saved as displacement A. That was my mistake. Don't make the same one as me. I need to actually open this texture. All right, so displacement B. It's kind of confusing. Blender has texture slots, which is different from texture files. So two different texture slots in Blender can be using the same texture file, which we just experienced. So I mistakenly only duplicated the texture slot and failed to create a unique texture block for that. So going to our image editor and opening Skin Utility Displacement B, I want to go to Image Save As and rename it to B. Okay, same thing, black and white 16-bit is going to be good. But this means I need to rebake Displacement A real quick. So we'll go back down to level 0 and bake that and save it properly. And that did not update. Do not be alarmed. If we go back to solid view, we do have texture. Let's see. That is not the same displacement I expected. Oh, I need to be on displacement A. There we go. That's what I'm expecting. Okay. Here I can go image, save as, and rename it or save it over the A version. And just to double check that I did that correctly, I want to image open to launch a file browser, and let's take a look at the thumbnails. All right, that's displacement A, that's displacement B. We're good. And that is going to be the first two utility textures. I want to bake two more in the next lesson.